Good afternoon. I'm Adam Erby. I'm Curator of Fine and Decorative Arts here at George Washington's Mount Vernon. And it's a pleasure to be back here with you for another edition of Mansion Mondays. Today, we're in the Washington Bedchamber, one of the most important and sacred rooms in the house. And I want to talk to you a little bit about this space. Before I want to get started, I want to thank a member of the audience out there today, a lady named Natalie Larson, who made me this wonderful mask with George Washington on it for me to stay safe during the coronavirus epidemic. So hope everyone at home is staying safe. So we'll get started. So we're in the Washington Bedchamber, which, as we all know, is the bedchamber in which George Washington passed away in December of 1799. This room was built, added to the mansion beginning in the early 1770s. And it was the beginning of it was part of a private wing that the Washingtons built in the 1770s when they expanded the mansion on either side. On this one side, the south side of the mansion, they added a servants' hall, which is in the basement, George Washington's study, which is immediately below us, the Washington Bedchamber, and up above us are what are called lumber rooms, which are were used for storage in the period. So and then on the north side of the mansion, the Washingtons added the new room, which we will be going and exploring on another one of these Mansion Mondays, hopefully sometime soon. So the purpose of this wing really was to pull the Washingtons' private lives out of the central core of the mansion and move them and give them privacy to the south side. The Washington Bedchamber that I'm standing in today, that was always referred to during the 18th century, during the Washingtons' lives, as Mrs. Washington's chamber. And the reason for that is this is really where she ran the affairs of the household. From this room, she oversaw the daily keeping of the house. She also oversaw, with a number of enslaved servants, she oversaw her reading and writing and whatever she needed to do at her writing desk, which you see here. She got dressed at her dressing table, which you also see in the room. And this was really the nucleus, the core of the house from which she ran her daily operations. George Washington had his own separate space, and that was in the study downstairs. So in the morning, he got up, went downstairs to the study, and that's where he would have gotten dressed. His clothes were kept down there. He would have gotten dressed with the help of an enslaved valet in that particular space. Now, the Washington Bedchamber, so Martha also used these two closets here to keep items that were particularly precious or valuable under lock and key. Things like clothing, her clothing would have been kept in here, but also bed hangings likely would have been in these spaces, as well as spices and expensive spices that she would have needed to distribute to enslaved people to use in cooking and other things. So these two doors back here would have remained under lock and key, and Martha Washington or one of the enslaved housemaids would have kept the keys at all times. Now, this space is particularly important and evocative and has been well recognized since George Washington passed away in here on December 14th, 1799. It's one of the rooms that survives with some of the most original furnishings in the house. The bed, which you see here, the bedstead, the wooden elements of this bed are the original wooden elements for the bed that the Washingtons bought in the 1790s in Philadelphia and brought here with them after the presidency, and it is the one in which Washington passed away. So after George Washington passed away in December of 1799, Martha moved to the third floor of the mansion, and that's where she stayed for the rest of her life. Stayed in the bedchamber up there, and she left this one closed and never went back inside. But immediately after that, after Martha Washington passed away, this space became a site of pilgrimage. So you see people coming here throughout the 19th century wanting to see the room in which George Washington died. And it is particularly evocative. But the room after Martha Washington passed away, the furnishings in this space were distributed to the grandchildren or purchased at auction. And so in reconstructing this room and figuring out what this room looked like, we have one really evocative image of the space. And I was, if Sarah wouldn't mind pulling that up right now, we'll talk about it for a second. This is a painting of done by John Gadsby Chapman in 1835. John Gadsby Chapman was an Alexandria artist who was working on a series of paintings about the Washington family. And Chapman probably was looking to do one of these heroic scenes of George Washington's death, and this painting was probably preparatory for that. So at that point in the 1830s, everything from this space had been distributed. So Chapman went to each of Martha Washington's grandchildren and asked them what they had from the room and where it was placed in the room. And he painted, and he came here, painted the room as it appeared at the time, and then he painted each of the individual objects into there at the direction of the grandchildren, the people who really remembered the space. So this painting is our most important documentary piece of documentation of how a space in the mansion appeared during the Washingtons' lifetimes. He put this on display at the National Academy of Design in 1835, and this piece actually came into the Mount Vernon collection in just a few years ago, in probably 2017. So the most important piece in it, in that painting, and we can move back to the room, is the bedstead. The bed is a typical Philadelphia bed out of the late 18th century. You can see the wonderful turned posts on the end. So it's fairly typical, but this made more important because of who used it and who died in it. It's a little bit wider and a little bit longer than ordinary beds would have been. And the textile that you see on it is what's called dimity. Dimity is a white cotton fabric that was very popular in the 18th century. At that point, in the late 18th century, in the neoclassical era, at that point, having something that was white, that was pure white, signified wealth, because you had the labor force and you were sufficiently separated from working from work that you were able to keep this bed clean. So keeping the white fabric was just very it was very prestigious in the time period. So Martha Washington had this gave this bed away to her grandson George Washington Bar Custis in her will, and she called it the bed I caused to be made in Philadelphia. As we've been doing restoration work here in the mansion, we found over the years a mouse nest behind the walls of this bedchamber, and in that nest there was a little fragment of this white dimity fabric, so indicating its use nearby. Very, very popular in the time period. Beds in the 18th century were some of your most valuable objects you could have purchased because of the expensive textiles that were used on the beds. The raw material was very expensive for textiles, and the amount of labor that went into making these textiles was absolutely extraordinary, because you're hand weaving all of this material on a loom, and so the beds were very expensive. They had mattresses built up, usually of horsehair. Horsehair, and for the elite bedsteads, horsehair, and on the bottom, and then a lighter feather mattress on top to give a little bit more comfort. And then these bed hangings could be closed, and it would keep you warm in the winter, when your body heat would keep you warm by generating in that particular space. So beds in the period were very important, and you see different beds throughout the house, and there was a hierarchy to these beds. Some are better because of the fabric that they're made out of. Some are a little bit more elite, and your more elite guests would have gotten the more elite bedstead. But this one is a very simple neoclassical white dimity. One little museum secret I'll share with you is that we today do not use horsehair mattresses for these beds because they remain covered up, and they would have gotten horsehair oftentimes gets infested. Pests come and infest the horsehair. So what we've used instead is actually packing peanuts that are in a sort of a sack that makes up the mattress, and it gives us the look that we need, and it's not something that attracts pests. So that's a little insider bit about these beds, and that's true of all the beds in the mansion. Moving around the room, some of the other original furnishings that I really enjoy are, this is Martha Washington's writing desk. This writing desk was purchased for her by George Washington in 1789. It was previously owned by the Marchioness de Brehon, who was a relative of the French minister to the United States in the early days of the Washington presidency. When the minister was recalled, he sold off all of the furnishings in his house, including this one, and the Washingtons purchased most of those and used them during the presidency. At this point, Parisian or French furniture was very popular in the period, and so these would have been some of the most fashionable items available in New York, which is where the capital was at the time. So George Washington purchased this desk for Martha, and she used it in here in the bedchamber after they came back from the presidency between 1797 and her in 1799 and George Washington's death. This piece it folds out for a writing surface. Just here, there are two doors, so you could have kept your letters inside, and there are a couple of drawers in here. And there's a wonderful evocative story about that the Washington correspondence was preserved by Martha Washington. And then after George Washington's death, presumably, she burned all of the correspondence between them to keep everything, but all of their personal correspondence, private. That was, and it would have been kept in this desk. That was except for two letters that slipped behind one of the drawers in this desk. And those letters were found by Martha Washington's granddaughter, Martha Parke Custis Peter, whose portrait you actually see just above. Those were found by Martha Parke Custis Peter sometime in the early 19th century. The two letters are very evocative and very sort of sentimental. They were letters when George Washington found out he'd been elected commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, him writing back to tell Martha that he had been elected commander-in-chief. And the next one was to tell Martha that he was going to Boston to take up the troops in Boston and take command of the military. And in that second letter, we own the second letter. The first letter is owned by Tudor Place, and he calls Martha Washington my dearest. And he says that in the very last line is very sentimentally. He said, "I retain an unalterable affection for you that neither time nor distance can separate us." So it's a really wonderful letter that is actually in the Washington Library today, and it's really evocative to think of Martha Washington writing these letters using this desk towards the end of her life. There's another piece in this room that's also particularly evocative of another earlier time in Martha's life, and that is the dressing table that you see here. It's a much earlier piece of furniture than anything else in the room. It was made by a Williamsburg cabinet maker, a man named Peter Scott, in 1754. And so it's a specialized piece of furniture, and Martha Washington would have gotten dressed sitting in front of this particular dressing table. So she would have kept all of her various toiletries in the drawers, and she would have used this on a daily basis as she got dressed. It's very neat and plain is what the English would have called the style of it, because there's not a whole lot of ornament to it. Well, this piece was purchased by Martha Washington's first husband, Daniel Parke Custis, in 1754. And it's one of the pieces that Martha brought with her when she moved here to Mount Vernon with George Washington. And I've always thought that this piece was particularly interesting, that It remains in the bedchamber, in the Washington's bedchamber, as a memento of those earlier days for Martha Washington. And so it's one of our, again, precious relics. It and the writing desk descended to the granddaughter Martha Parke Custis Peter at Tudor Place, and it came back here years ago from that house. Other really important they're wonderfully important portraits. So the only room in the house that you see family portraiture, other than the front parlor, which is also a central space for Martha Washington, is up here in the Washington bedchamber. This is where Martha, again, showed off her family. And so we have wonderful portraits here of Martha Parke Custis Peter on the left, and Eliza, well, she becomes Martha Parke Custis Peter later, and Eliza Custis on the right. Those are two original portraits by English artist by the name of Robert H. Pine. And over on this side are the other two Custis grandchildren. These are George Washington Parke Custis on the right and Eleanor Parke Custis on the left. The originals of these portraits are owned by Washington and Lee University, and you can see them if you go out there. They're on view, but they've graciously allowed us to create a reproduction of these. So these are the four children of Martha Washington's son, John Parke Custis, or Jackie. Martha had two kids that lived to relative adulthood, Jackie and Patsy. Patsy lived to be 16. Jackie lived on to have children. He married Eleanor Calvert, and he married Eleanor Calvert and had these four children. Jackie passed away in right after the Battle of Yorktown in 1781, and the Washingtons raised the two youngest children, Nellie and George Washington Parke Custis, as their own, but they were very close to all four of them. And the Custis grandchildren, in a way, carry on a lot of the Washington legacy. They own a lot of the objects. They were some of them were raised by the Washingtons, so you see a very close family connection. But these are all painted by an English artist by the name of Robert H. Pine. Pine came over to the United States after the American Revolution. And he had, during the American Revolution, while he was in England, he created a painting and a print supportive of the American cause, really over the British cause. And he complained towards the end of the war that he lost all of his business because of that print. So he came over here to America. He was to the United States. He was good friends with George William Fairfax and some other politically Englishmen who were supportive of the American cause. And lots of these people wrote letters to George Washington, encouraging them to patronize Robert H. Pine when he came here to America. So he arrives here in the mid-1780s, comes down to Mount Vernon to paint the most famous man in America. George Washington allows himself to be painted, but he also commissions 4 portraits of the Custis grandchildren from Robert H. Pine, and these are 2 of the 4. The other 2, as I said, are at Washington and Lee. And Pine has an interesting technique that I've never really seen used by another artist. So Pine would come to a patron's house and paint an individual's face on a small piece of canvas about like this. Then he would take the canvas home to his wife and children, who would sew it into a larger canvas, and they would fill in the background. So you see that in each of these 4, you can't actually, ours have been treated very well, so you can't actually see the lines. But in some of the Robert H. Pine paintings that are out there, if they've been relined, you can see that the impression coming through. So it was a real family enterprise for him to create these paintings. One thing I want to say at this point is, if you have questions, please feel free to write them in the comment section, and we'll get to those in just a few minutes. Other original objects in the space, we have this wonderful French bidet that belonged to Martha. It was an unusual furniture form to have a bidet in 18th century America. It was very French. And again, this is one of the pieces purchased by the Washingtons from the French minister, the Comte de Moustier. Martha brought it back here with her. We can see that we see it on the listed on the manifest of the ship it came back on, and it came back here and was used in probably this closet, or it could have been even either one of the closets. And so she would have used it there. By the 19th century, however, they sort of lost the connotation, and there weren't a whole lot of bidets in America again. And they thought it, in the 19th century, the owners of it thought it was a shoebox. So it was very much advertised. So when it came back to Mount Vernon, it came back as a shoebox, but we quickly recognized what it was. One other piece to point out is this chest on chest, which is a stand-in. It's the only piece of case furniture, really large piece of case furniture that you see in the mansion. And it would have been, you see closets in the house to hold clothes, but this would have been probably to hold lots of Martha Washington's clothes and linens. This is not an original piece to Mount Vernon. This piece is actually one that we purchased to represent the original. The original is at Tudor Place, again, the home of one of the granddaughters, and their original piece that still survives belonged initially to George William and Sally Fairfax at neighboring Belvoir Plantation. And George Washington bought the piece after the Fairfaxes moved back to England just before the American Revolution, and they kept the chest on chest in their bedchamber as a sort of memento of the Fairfax family and their best friends. A couple other pieces to point out in the space are this French clock that you see above on the mantelpiece. This is the only clock that I can find reference to the Washingtons actually owning. So tall case clocks are what some people call grandfather clocks. I can find no reference to the Washingtons owning any of those. We do see the Washingtons owning watches in this French clock. We're not exactly sure when in the 1790s they got it, but this is the clock that was here in the room when Washington passed away. And then down below, we have a fireback, which is a cast iron element that is meant to reflect heat out into the room and protect the brickwork. And that cast iron piece has Washington's crest from his coat of arms, and it also has his initials in a cipher there. Before I turn it over to questions, let's head outside of the room for just 1 second. So one of the really important aspects of this room is that it was cut off from the main body of the house. And as you all know, there were many, many guests coming to Mount Vernon really in the 1770s, 1780s, and 1790s. So the door that you see back here, that was not there. That wasn't put in place until the 19th century. We probably had a closet here. And so access to the Washington bedchamber was really from downstairs. And so, you would have come upstairs to the Washington bedchamber. So if enslaved servants needed to make it to the Washington bedchamber, they would have come in the side door here, come upstairs, and come into the Washington bedchamber. They also could have gone upstairs to the third floor and come through a back way. And so the service in the area was cut off a little bit from the main body of the house. And that gave the Washingtons the privacy that they needed. A lot of people ask, why did Martha Washington move to the third floor of the mansion after George Washington passed away? It just seems like such a different space and not as nice, obviously, as the Washington bedchamber. What I've always said about that is that she probably moved to the third floor because she got a similar amount of privacy on the third floor, because people, the second floor remained really the center of hospitality, the bedchambers for the Washington's guests. With that, I will turn it over for questions.
Great, Adam. We have a question from Instagram from Caitlin. Weren't people allowed to stay in the mansion in the past, and why and when did that end?
That's a very good question. Certain people were allowed to stay in the mansion until the early 20th century. So we have a board called the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, who owns and operates Mount Vernon. And before they had separate buildings to house, Mount Vernon is a little bit remote, and would have been very remote in the 19th century. It's not near any hotels or anything, and wouldn't have been at the time. So when the board came here to meet in their twice yearly meeting called council, they would have stayed in the rooms in the mansion. They would have stayed in the rooms in the mansion and also stayed in rooms in some of the outbuildings. The vice regent, each of these rooms in the mansion was assigned to a particular board member, what we call a vice regent, and she was responsible for furnishing it. And because this is such a central room to the house, the vice regent for Virginia had this room, and she is the one who would have stayed in the space during those times. And so we still have some. In the past years, we've had some of the mattresses that remained around from that time in the collection. So it was really the board members who stayed in the house, and that changed in the early 20th century when we built various spaces, including there's a building built, office building that housed the ladies, and we call where the ladies stay today quarters.
Great. And we got a question from Suzanne, who would like to know, the Washington bedroom I saw on the tour 6 years ago did not look as nice as this. Has it been refurbished or redecorated?
That's a good question. And that is 6 years ago. It should have looked like this. And so it was last redone, I believe, in 2005 or 2006. That's when you got the most current iteration of the white dimity bed hangings that you see here. It was last redone about that time. It is due for another redo in the next few years, hopefully before 2026. And what we found, the most recent research we found, is that there was wallpaper in this room. Often you see these fabulous white dimity beds with that are sort of the calm tone in a room with a much louder wallpaper. And so there are fragments of what we think might be the original wallpaper that were found in the late 19th and early 20th century in the room. And we hope to reinstall a reproduction of that wallpaper in the space, and it'll change the feeling of the room quite a bit, but that's up and coming.
So Adam, Emily would like to know, was a canopy bed like that popular in Washington's time, and was it a mark of wealth and status?
Yes. So having a four-poster bed with these curtains was a mark of wealth and status. Again, one of the most expensive objects you could have bought for an individual room. You see lots of low-post beds in the 18th century that don't have the elaborate curtains. It would have been quite a bit cooler in those during the winter. And then you also see both enslaved people and white servants living out on the plantation who would have just slept on a pallet that was basically on the floor. So it really is a hierarchical system.
And Adam, Joan has noticed about the carpeting. Wouldn't they have had a solid carpet or wood?
The carpeting that we have in here today, we know that there was carpet in the space. And this is a popular pattern called a list pattern that you could have had in the period. And this is what was chosen in 2006. This is something we will explore again as we're looking at the room. The wood, the Washingtons often did have carpeting in the rooms. And then you see in some of the other bed chambers that often what they had was just two little strips of carpet that were right next to the bed called bedside carpet. So when you got out of bed, your feet didn't get cold immediately. So that's one of the research questions we have, but this is a very appropriate pattern for the 1790s in America.
And Adam, we have a question on the tea set.
The tea set's not in here right now, but I know exactly what you're talking about. What's the question?
Is it a replica or original piece?
The tea set that's usually that is in here sometimes is a set that has a history of being given to one of the grandchildren by the Marquis de Lafayette. And it's just not currently set up in the room. We have a little bit of a different scenario set up in the space right now.
And Adam, Bethany would like to know, how old is Mrs. Washington's dressing table and the bed?
So the bed itself was made in the 1790s, and that's just the wooden elements of the bed. There are different parts of a bed in the 18th century. The bedstead, which we think of today as the most sort of precious element, is actually would have been one of the least expensive elements in the period. The Washingtons is made out of mahogany. What they would have called the bed is actually the mattresses that would have been on the bed, and those have long since been gone. And then the bed hangings or the bed furniture is what they would have been called in the period. Those are the hangings that you see on the bed. The dressing table was made in 1754 in Williamsburg. It's one of the few pieces of Virginia furniture you'll see in the house. George Washington mostly acquired his furniture either from England or from Philadelphia, but the earlier generation, the Custesses, Martha Washington's first husband, acquired a number of pieces in Williamsburg. So this is one of the few Virginia-made pieces made in Williamsburg by a man named Peter Scott.
And Adam, a new question from Alice. How long is the bed?
How long is the bed? I should look that up. It's a little bit longer than usual. That's it's a little bit more than 6 feet. It's longer than what Washington would have needed, but we'll respond to that question afterwards on a comment, and I can give you the exact dimensions of the bed.
You can find it on our collections online.
You can find it on the collections online, exactly.
And Melissa would like to know, when Martha went to the third floor, did the space resemble this bedroom closet to keep the spices and belongings in the fireplace, or was it difficult for her to get to the third floor as she aged?
That's a good question. And from all accounts we have Martha Washington, she was coming up and down the stairs really until her final illness, coming down and taking her meals in the dining room. The spice closet, I'm not exactly sure where that would have been. There's another closet up on the second floor that the Washingtons called the sweetmeat closet, and that's where they kept all of their really expensive china, ceramics. And so she could have kept the spices up there, but I don't know that we don't entirely have the answer to that question. Neither Martha's probate inventory nor George's probate inventory lists all the spices. So we're working from period practice and figuring out that these are the spaces that would have been kept.
And Adam, Fred would like to know, what was it typical for the walls to be plain white? I guess you did answer some of this. There's so many other rooms that are filled with color.
Exactly. So as we're doing this research, we're finding that basically every space that had plain plaster walls in the mansion, with one real exception, was covered with wallpaper when the Washingtons could get wallpaper. The dining room downstairs, the one that's bright green, that has plaster walls. It doesn't have wallpaper, but that bright green imitates a green verdigris wallpaper. So every space in here, and so you'll see more wallpapers creeping into these spaces in the next few years as we're able to get to these additional bed chambers. The Washingtons started buying wallpaper in the 1750s. It was a new and fashionable thing at that point, and they buy it about every 10 years, replacing the wallpaper in the house until 1797, when they really come back and redo the mansion one last time. And you see a lot of neoclassical, or what we sometimes in America call federal wallpapers.
And Adam, a question from Kelly. The two closets in the room, would one be for Martha's personal items, clothing, shoes, and jewelry, and the other filled with household items, or how would they have been used?
That's a good question, and it's one we don't entirely know the answer to. Presumably this closet here with all the wonderful shelving, that would have been the one where things were kept under lock and key. The other one may have been Martha Washington's dressing room. But it's a little bit unusual because several of our sources have the dressing table out here, which you would expect to have the dressing table in the dressing room. And then that painting, as you remember, has the dressing table out here. So it may have been that this room was also just used as a closet where things were kept under lock and key. But again, this is something we need to do further research on and figure out a little bit more. Maybe that we were never able to figure it out because the evidence might not be there.
And Adam, Sherry would like to know, are there any pieces that are not in the room that are in the original inventory?
There are a few pieces that are in the original inventory that are not in the room. Particular examples of that are, there are a few prints. There's one of General Knox that we know was in the room, and that's the original of that is owned by Tudor Place. We have to get a replica in here. At some point, another one is the Countess of Huntington. There's an image of her. There were another 2 family pictures. We don't know exactly what those were, but we know that these 4 were here. There was also a chair that went with the French dressing table that we're working on figuring out a little bit more about. And then there's some drawings and various things hanging on the walls. But pretty much what you see is what was in the room in the 18th century.
And Adam, a question from Nancy. Which piece in the bedchamber is of the most historical value?
Well, I think you sort of have to say with that the bed. It is the bed in which George Washington died. It has the most historical value, but it's hard to say what has the most, because you have the bed in which George Washington died. You have the Martha Washington's writing desk, and you have this wonderful dressing table. All of them tell different stories, and to me, all of them are sort of equally important in telling the story of the Washingtons at Mount Vernon.
And I have a question from Gloria. What time would they retire at night?
My recollection of when they retired is about 9 o'clock in the evening, but I'd have to do a little bit more research on that. I certainly know that George Washington was up by sunup, so he needed to get his rest. And so he was up by sunup in the winter a little bit before. And then Martha would get up and go run the affairs of the house in the morning, get breakfast, to work with the enslaved cooks on breakfast, and get breakfast served in between 7 and 7:30. So that was an everyday practice. And then Martha would come back up here between 9 and 10 o'clock in the morning and read scripture and the Book of Common Prayer, and sort of pray and reflect on the day. So those are a few of those are some data points I know off the top of my head, but I think probably between 9 and 10 o'clock in the evening.
And Adam, Cindy would like to know, what is the small object on the mantle next to the clock?
Yes. So that is a candle snuffer, and it's not really a snuffer. It's a candle nipper, and basically in the 18th century, the candle itself burned. You didn't have self-consuming wicks like you do today, and so as the candle burned down, the wick stayed up, and you had to snip the wick off of the top of the candle. So you see those in a lot of these inventories and in these houses. And let me show another one that I really like over here. This is another example. This is called a chamber stick because it was meant to be taken to the bedchamber. This is a silver example. We know the Countess family owned a couple of these, but it has both a snuffer that you see here that can be taken off, and it's all very compact, and you can carry it on this little stand. And then you have the little nippers to cut the wicks, or wick trimmers is what they would have been called in the period. So you've got both of those things in a very compact form.
And Adam, a question for Kimberly: would the mantles be that bare normally?
Mantles be that bare?
I guess only a few objects.
Only a few objects on them. I think absolutely they would have been. It depends on the space as to whether the mantle would have been bare. This one we have it listed, and it's really only the clock that you see on the inventory for this particular space. And the chamber stick might have been there, but in other spaces, like in the front parlor, you see a set of 5 garnitures or vases on the piece, on the mantle. So it really depended based on the sort of stature and what you were trying to show off in the space, whether it would be more or less elaborate on those spaces.
And Adam, Bethany would like to know, did Martha have anything from Daniel Parcustis?
Daniel Parcustis. So when Martha came here to Mount Vernon, she brought with her a number of objects that were used to furnish their house in New Kent County, White House Plantation, and there's a listing of that in the Washington papers. And so we know those objects very specifically. This is one of the ones that's listed, the dressing table. There on the third floor, there is a marble top slab table called a sideboard. And then there are sets of prints of flowers and of fruits that for the months of the year that you see reproduced a lot, that called the Ferber prints. And they really, and she brought those with her, and there were 12 of each, one for each month, and then both fruit and flowers. And those were in two display areas, probably initially in the parlor and the dining room in the house. So there were beds, there were linens, lots of things brought with Martha, and she had the use of these things for the course of, she inherited some of it outright, and she had the use of a lot of it over the course of her life. So there are numerous Custis pieces you'll find throughout the house, sort of here and there, that remain in the house throughout the Washingtons' lives.
And Betsy would like to know, what did George die of?
George died of something called quinsy in the what they called it in the 18th century. And my understanding is it was called epiglottitis. And epiglottitis is an inflammation of a gland in your throat. And really, it sort of swelled up and suffocated Washington at the end, unfortunately. But without really the advent of modern day antibiotics like penicillin, they wouldn't have been able to cure it in the 18th century. So it was this unfortunately slow and painful death that Washington suffered from with the epiglottitis or the quinsy.
And Adam, Carolyn would like to know, when you source unoriginal furniture and items, where do they come from?
That's a good question. We're always on the lookout for furniture that resembles what the Washingtons owned. In each of these projects that you see in the mansion, you'll see some element that's introduced that is a piece of furniture. So sometimes we use we try as much as we can to use antiques that are similar to the ones the Washingtons own. So we send out to a network of antique dealers and auction houses what we're looking for say chairs, and using Washington's documentary evidence. A lot of furniture in the mansion doesn't survive really from the central core of the house, and so we have had to use Washington's documents to try to find similar examples. Another way we've done that is like in the front parlor, we've used reproductions. If we have really great documentary evidence and we're not able to find on the marketplace pieces of furniture that are close enough to what the Washingtons had, we oftentimes will make reproductions. And the front parlor with the back stools, which are the chairs and the sofa, we did reproductions. So it's a mix. We're always out there looking. We're always looking at comparable examples that we see out in other museums that are documented, and we want to be able to use those to make create the most authentic appearance for the mansion that we possibly can.
And Adam, Amanda would like to know, what are the photos in the round frames?
These are prints, engravings that are Washington originals, and they're scenes from a popular novel of the period called The Sorrows of Werther. And they are prints that are listed in they're prints listed in the Washington Probate Inventory, and it's thought that these are among them very sentimental sort of scenes that the Washingtons had in this particular space in their original frames.
And Adam, Daniel would like to know, what route would the general have taken to his office?
to his office. So George Washington would have gotten up in the morning. We're not sure which side of the bed he slept on. He would have gone out into this little passage, gone downstairs, and gone through the little vestibule right into the study. And there's a closet back there where his clothing would have been kept, but his enslaved valet would have also brought the clothing out for him.
And Ashley would like to know, if Martha Washington moved to the third floor after George Washington's death, what use did their bedchamber have? And did they allow guests to use it?
That's a good question. My understanding is the bedchamber stayed under lock and key, but I would need to do a little bit more research into that to figure it out. It's certainly a space that Martha never went back into.
And Adam, Samuel would like to know, when was the fireplace last used? In the 19th century?
I presume it would be in the 19th century. That would be my guess. But we don't have. We'll have to go back through the minutes of the board and find out when that was. I'm sure they tell us when they closed up when they capped off the fireplace, the chimneys, and we're no longer using it.
And Adam, Joy would like to know, what room did Lafayette's son stay in when he lived with the Washingtons?
That's a good question. And so in the bedchambers in the central core of the house, certainly it would have been one of the central core bedchambers, but which one, we don't exactly know. There are only a few instances where we do know a person would have stayed in a particular bedchamber. Lafayette, we know that because it's commemorated by his portrait in there. Eliza Parke Custis, one of the granddaughters, she engraved her name in one of the window panes. And then and then Eleanor Custis or Nellie Custis stayed in one particular bedchamber, and she may have had her first child in there. So those are three bedchambers we know where people stayed, but the rest, it's really difficult to say.
And Adam, Roger would like to know, was the bedroom placed strategically so that the Washington could see the closet, farm, old tomb, and fishing wharf?
That's a good question. I think it was. I think it was placed down here mainly out of the way that the house unfolded. I don't think it was placed strategically. One thing that was said in the 19th century, there was a different idea of where the Martha Washington's bedchamber was, and it was thought that it was what's now a lumber room just above us. And the thing that was said at the time was that it was there so that Martha could see the tomb in which George Washington was laid to rest, and it actually turned out not to be that room. So I don't think there are particular view sheds that they're looking at here. There might be view sheds that are sort of more based on service and people and surveillance. So what's going on the plantation landscape at a given time. So you can see down over here to the stable. There might have been trees between here and there at the time, but see down to the stable and see some of these outbuildings over here. That would have been more what they would have been interested in seeing at the time.
And Adam, Melissa Robertson would like to know, can you share a little bit more about the closet spaces? They seem large for the period.
They are very large for the period, and these are the largest. And hello to Melissa Robertson. These are the largest closets that you see in the house. They're actually fairly enormous by 18th century standards. You don't see they're almost as a room to themselves. They have shelving in here, and there are numbers of trunks listed in these spaces. So there could have been a lot of material in these particular rooms. When beds weren't in use, the bed hangings would have been taken off of the beds, probably stored probably stored in this space. So there would have been a lot of different objects in the space. And I think it speaks to how large a household Martha was running, that they had such large closets. If you look at comparable Virginia estates, a place like Kenmore in Fredericksburg, which is home to Betty Lewis, George's sister, or Gunston Hall, the closets are much smaller. But I think that really speaks to that, and the size of the kitchen speak to the level of hospitality that were being meted out here at Mount Vernon. So really, that's an important concept. But also, if you look at other rooms, there are very few rooms that have closets. There are a couple, or one, the chintz bedchamber has a closet, very, very small closet. And then the yellow bedchamber has a small sort of a cupboard in there. But otherwise, it's really just this bedchamber that has these large closets.
And Adam Gordon would like to know, are there any Washington pieces in other collections that Mount Vernon is hoping to obtain in the future?
There are always Washington pieces out there. And Mount Vernon, we have enormous files of what we call Washingtoniana unowned. These are pieces that have come to previous curators and in the form of inquiries or things that we've gone out and seen over past years. And so there are objects that survive in Washington family collections. There are objects that survive in private collections. And we're always, when they do come up on the market, or when someone is seeking to sell them, we're always interested in bringing those original objects back home to Mount Vernon. And the Mount Vernon Ladies Association has a strong history with bringing back original objects, really starting from day one when the harpsichord came back to the mansion as a gift of Nellie Custis's descendants. It was being housed at Arlington House and this was just before the outbreak of the Civil War. And so every year after that, you've seen original Washington objects coming back over time. And so there's always more to find.
And Adam, Jess would like to know, you referenced inventories several times. Can you tell a little bit more about these documents, and were inventories taken by the Washingtons during their lifetime, or what's the provenance of those? Absolutely.
So the inventories I reference today are the probate inventories. So these are inventories that are taken after George and Martha Washington's deaths to account for everything that they owned, all the physical objects that they owned. So those are very detailed and specific, and each one of them goes room by room. So that's Martha Washington. George Washington gave to Martha Washington all the household effects, and then Martha Washington decided to have a sale after her death for objects that weren't specifically given away in her will. And so these are countings of how all that material takes place. So for George, the executors of his estate take that account, and they walk through the house and list everything out. And we spend a lot of time looking at these documents and asking ourselves, are they walking through the room in a particular way that shows how the furniture was arranged? Or what are they not seeing in the spaces? Like clothing is usually not listed. And then Martha's are taken in 1802, and you see a draft list that comes first. And then the draft list is everything in there, and then things are crossed out. Those are pieces that are specifically given away to other people and don't end up being sold later on. So the inventories are really helpful documents for figuring out, and really the core documents for figuring out the way Mount Vernon looked. Now, some estates you'll see some inventories taken at different times, usually at a time of change. We don't see those here at Mount Vernon. Like if you're going to move, maybe you would do an inventory. I know of a particular house in Southern Virginia where you see all of the ceramics and all of the linens that are inventoried so that they could then be accounted for later. But you don't see that here at Mount Vernon. It's really only the probate inventories that are taken after the Washingtons pass away. And then we're also helped by earlier documentation when the Washingtons purchased objects.
And Adam, Diana would like to know, did Washington's relatives who had inherited the home use this bedroom?
There are various accounts of Washington's relatives using this bedchamber, yes. But at a certain point, really, I think probably by the 1850s, it seems that the space is uninhabited. And you see a print in this book done by a man named Benson Lossing, the first sort of monograph on an American house. Benson Lossing does a print, and you can see people are being brought into this space. It's completely empty, and all you can see is the mantelpiece in the room and the chair rail. And so I think probably by the 1850s, there's so many people coming through and looking at it that it's not really inhabited.
And Adam, Lisa would like to know, had the Washingtons' bed remained with the house after their death, or had it been provided to someone else, and how did we acquire it?
Exactly. So this particular bed went to, it was given away in Martha's will to George Washington Bart Custis, her grandson. And he got it, and she called it the bed I caused to be made in Philadelphia. He got the bed and took it to Arlington House, which he was building. He starts building a little bit after her death, and is in the center of what's now Arlington National Cemetery. So the bed goes there, and it's set up, and that's where John Gadsby Chapman, who painted the painting I showed you earlier, would have seen it when he was there visiting. And then the piece comes back to us in the 19th century from descendants of George Washington Bart Custis, and it's given to us. And I think it's the actual transfer. It comes back to us earlier, and then it's transferred to us in about 1907, I think is the correct time. But it's here from the late 19th century, so you see lots of images in the late 19th century. But all that comes back to us basically is the bedstead, the wooden elements, the textiles, with a couple of exceptions. There are little bits that we think do survive, but most of the textiles were gone by that point.
Great. Adam and Lily would like to know, after the Washingtons passed away, what happened to the house?
After the Washingtons passed away, so in 1802, when Martha Washington died, there were estate sales here, and everything was sold off, and to pay for the education of two of her nephews. And then when it was sold off, and then George Washington's nephew, Bushrod Washington, inherited the house. Bushrod was a member of the Supreme Court of the United States, and very sort of learned, scholarly man. He came here and lived with his wife, never had any children, but he also inherited the Washington papers and the Washington books. So you see the books remain in the study and the papers as well. And so Bushrod owns the house until 1829. In 1829, he dies, again, without children, and the house goes to his nephew, John Agustin Washington II. John Agustin Washington II lives here for a couple of years, but dies very early on in the 1830s. And he leaves his widow, Jane Charlotte Blackburn Washington, who takes care of the house for her small children and her son, John Agustin Washington III, for about the next decade or so. John Agustin Washington III then inherits the property. And when he inherits the property, he inherits it and keeps it until 1860, and that's when he sold to the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. So there are very few private owners between George and Martha Washington and the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. You don't get things like electricity and plumbing, and those things don't come into the house at that period.
Madam, Hannah would like to know, is it true that people have seen George Washington's ghost?
That's a good question, and I have never heard of anyone seeing George Washington's ghost. At least I've never paid attention when anybody said they saw George Washington's ghost. That's a good question. I think George Washington is very happy and very content, and I don't think he haunts us.
Madam Allen would like to know, is the wooden flooring in the bedroom all original, and what type of floor was used?
So this is one room that I would say, unless my preservation colleagues correct me, I'm pretty sure that this is one of the original floors in the mansion. I know certainly the study below is original. It is southern yellow pine, which was a very hardy hardwood in the period. Not hard and hard. It's a hard wearing wood in the period, and it is appropriate to what would have been here if it is not the original, which I think it probably is.
Great. And Adam, Joshua would like to know, are there many original articles of clothing in the collection?
That's a wonderful question. There are actually lots of articles of clothing that remain in the collection or have come back here. All of them have actually come back here to Mount Vernon. We have the suit in which Washington, or the jacket in which Washington was inaugurated as President of the United States. We have one of Martha Washington's dresses. We have a number of fragments of Washington clothing, and we're actually working on a major project right now to rehouse all of the original Washington textiles in our storage facility. Textiles are very light sensitive, and they're often, so we only put them on view for a very brief period in low lighting every few years. But one of the interesting phenomena that happens is during the 19th century, the grandchildren who inherited some of Martha's dresses cut them up, particularly Eliza, cut them up and give them away as mementos of the Washingtons. So they also often have interesting histories of being given away to the grandchildren, to members of the public who wanted a relic of the Washingtons. I know the painter, John Gadsby Chapman, who we mentioned earlier, he got fragments of Martha's dresses from Nellie Custis just down the road at Woodlawn Plantation. So we have lots of fragments in the collection as well.
And I have time for one more question from Mary. Do you have any type of registry of Washington's living descendants? Do you keep in touch with them, and are they involved with Mount Vernon?
That's a good question. There are multi-volume books in the library that have that are both the Custis descendants and the Washington descendants, and we do keep in touch with a lot of these descendants today. And a lot of them are involved. We always encourage them to come back here to Mount Vernon. It's wonderful to have that active family connection here at Mount Vernon, and to hear the tales they tell, and sometimes tell the tales of the objects that they owned, that are family objects, and the stories they have from the family. So we do try to stay in touch. Well, thank you so much for joining us today on Mansion Mondays. It's always a pleasure to show you around. Please stay safe as you go through your week, and we look forward to doing another Mansion Monday next week.